Welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. This weekend, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting over the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in the eastern part of Syria. That attack killed at least 62 Syrian troops that have been fighting the Islamic State. For the U.S. forces, the attacks which happened in Deir al-Zur had not been intentional and were halted once they were informed of the Syrian presence. It was just last week the U.S. and Russia signed an agreement halting hostilities to allow aid into areas needed the most in Syria.
Syrians in the eastern part of Aleppo enjoying the peace afforded from the ceasefire deal brokered by the U.S. and Russia. The ceasefire took effect on Monday, September the 12th, and is supported by countries that back President Assad and his opponents. It will be the second time fighting parties have halted the war since the crisis began 5 years ago. In the agreement, nationalist rebels fighting under the banner of the Free Syrian Army are supposed to disengage from a group that was known as the Nusra Front until it broke ties with Al-Qaeda in July and changed its name to Jabhat Fateh al-Sham. The ceasefire has allowed residents go shopping and walk through the streets freely without worrying about an airstrike or gunfire. But aid locked at the border is the true test of whether the ceasefire is working or not. A situation criticized by the United Nations as humanitarian advisor Jan Egeland called on well-fed grown men to unblock aid that was supposed to move unhindered under the New Deal.
Well-fed grown men, please stop putting political, bureaucratic and procedural roadblocks for brave humanitarian workers that are willing and able to go to serve women, children, wounded civilians in besieged and crossfire areas.
Egeland added there'd been no report of civilian killings in the past 1 day and attacks on schools and hospitals had stopped. As at Friday, the UN said none of the 40 trucks ready to bring aid to eastern Syria had moved from no man's land at the Turkish border due to a lack of security guarantees.
They are ready to go immediately when there is a 48-hour pause. We're still negotiating the access road and the modalities of this, including with the armed opposition groups. It's urgent that we get an agreement. We were informed today that there are now 4,000 food rations left. That would be enough for 20,000 people, and the population of East Aleppo is 250,000. I'm hopeful that we will have a breakthrough.
The trucks, divided into two convoys of 20 trucks each, are ready to reach East Aleppo, the biggest flashpoint of recent fighting, through the supply route of Castello roads, which still has to be secured, following the agreement of a shaky ceasefire. Aleppo has been a focal point for the war this year, as government forces backed by militia from Iran, Iraq and Lebanon recently achieved their long-held objective of encircling the rebel-held east. However, MRE refugees are leaving the country in the fear of what could happen when the ceasefire expires. Some 30,000 Syrians crossed into Turkish Cilvagozu to celebrate the Eid holiday. But the Russian Defense Ministry says it's recorded 45 violations of the ceasefire agreement. The ministry said Russian and Syrian forces had stopped bombing areas held by opposition forces, but the United States was complicating efforts to fight terrorists in the country by not providing the exact locations of moderate opposition groups. On Saturday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said he believed a truce in the country was the common goal of both Moscow and Washington. Both sides have said they want to extend the ceasefire despite the fact that it's a bit shaky right now. President Putin says he'd appreciate both sides being honest with each other as this would help them achieve their goals. Nearly 5 million Syrians have fled the country, while about 6.5 million have been internally displaced during the crisis, contributing to the record 65.3 million people who were uprooted worldwide last year.
The crisis in Syria will certainly be on the table as leaders meet this week in New York for the UN General Assembly, and we'll have more on that later. President Muhammadu Buhari is already in New York, ready to discuss with President Barack Obama on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. This will probably be the last time the both leaders meet at an international event before U.S. President Barack Obama leaves office in January. It will, however, be President Buhari's second time at the UNGA since assuming office in May last year. The VOA's Margaret Bashir sent in this report on what to expect at the UNGA.
Leaders want to limit the spillover from the Syrian war, mainly the human exodus to overwhelm neighboring countries and Europe. They will discuss the issue at 2 summits focusing on refugees. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon will host the first meeting on Monday.
More countries must resettle more people who have been forced from their homes. More countries must recognize the benefits of migration. And everyone, everywhere, must stand up against the animosity that so many refugees, migrants, and minority communities face.
President Barack Obama will host a second summit on Tuesday.
We expect that the summit will result in significant new sustained commitments to UN humanitarian appeals, expanded refugee resettlement programs or alternative legal pathways for admission.
But there is skepticism that either summit will do much to improve the situation of the nearly 5 million Syrians who have fled their homeland.
The only way you solve the Syrian crisis is through a political deal. I'm sure there will be some talk about that at the General Assembly, but Vladimir Putin is not coming to New York, and if Putin's not here, you can't have serious talks about Syria.
The United States and Russia agreed to a deal earlier this month for a ceasefire and on getting aid into Syria. The 2 countries also plan to cooperate on targeting terrorists, including the so-called Islamic State. Whether that deal is working or failing will likely shape discussions in New York. The UN Security Council will hold a high-level session Wednesday intended to put the spotlight on Syria, but expectations for results are low.
The reality is decisions about Syria are made in Washington and Moscow and in Iran, not in the Security Council chamber.
The rest of the week will be dominated by leaders' speeches in the General Assembly. Some big names like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Angela Merkel will be absent. It will be President Obama's final time as U.S. president at the international gathering, and his speech will likely lay out his multilateralism legacy. It will also be Ban Ki-moon's final General Assembly as UN chief. His decade-long tenure ends on December 31st.
Nigeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Onyema, held a press briefing at the UN on Friday, where he highlighted developments in Nigeria and what the country will be sharing with others at the UNGA's 71st session.
Probably one of the most deadly terrorist organizations confronting our government, the Boko Haram, and that has absolutely caused havoc in our country. We have over 2 million displaced persons, internally displaced, and of course a large number of refugees in neighboring countries, over 70,000 refugees. It's been enormous, the damage to infrastructure, to housing. Not always easy when you have military far away in remote areas and engaging with enemies that have absolutely no scruples whatsoever. And in liberated areas, we are taking steps to, as quickly as possible, get into place civilian law enforcement people, the police and so forth, and moving the military out. And we believe that this will, to a very large extent, first of all, give confidence to the returning victims and others, and ensure that the contact is not the military and the civilian.